Hey readers, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name is Paloma, and today's video is going to be my review of How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. So let's get started. So I had learned about How the Word is Passed through a book recommendation on TikTok, and I thought not only was the title really interesting, but I also thought the premise of the book was really interesting as well. So because I don't really read nonfiction books, I thought this was a really great place for me to start because I think the topic is really poignant. So, this widely acclaimed exploration of the legacy of slavery illustrates how some of our country's most essential stories are hidden in plain view. Informed by scholarship and made vivid by the story of people living today, How the Word is Passed is a stunning work of reflection and insight that offers a new understanding of the hopeful role that memory and history can play in making sense of our country and how it has come to be. What really drew me to the book was not only the title and the topic of the book, but more or less expanding my knowledge on slavery beyond what we learn in school. Because after reading this book, I realized that I have a baseline knowledge of slavery. Obviously, we know that, the transatlantic slave trade, for the most part, some of the African tribes would sell off their prisoners to the slave traders, and that's how they would get separated from their families during wars between tribes. You hear about how devastating slavery was, how families were separated, how they were brutalized, how their spirits were broken, and those who managed to survive still persevered in spite of that. But what really made the book really interesting was actually the epilogue. Even though he goes through all this research, meeting with the people and speaking with them as well as doing academic research, what really drives the point home of the book is speaking to his grandparents about how slavery and segregation has impacted them in their lives. When we talk about segregation and racism, to be honest, for the most part, in my personal experience, we kind of view it through the eyes of the 1960s civil rights movement. So it's really trapped behind black and white images, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and people like that. But then you don't really see the ordinary people that are going through this segregation and racism as well. It's not just the people who made the biggest noise, it's also the people who were just trying to live their day to day. And I thought that was really poignant because in my personal experience, I'm of Caribbean descent, so I don't really have any ties to American slavery. My slavery comes from the Caribbean, with my father's side of the family being from Haiti and my mother's side being from Trinidad. So obviously, slavery is still bad in all those countries, and we had the Haitian Revolution, and Trinidad did gain independence from England. But it's completely... I don't want to put one on top of the other because really and truly both sides were bad, but American racism and segregation really still does echo beyond when it ended, if it ever ended at all, especially when it comes to the topic of slavery. And in the book, he sees that slavery is still very much a part of the American country, even if it doesn't even seem like it. People are not physically shackled in chains, but we are still in the metaphorical chains, whether it's an economic way, physical way, police brutality, and things like that. I think Clint Smith's writing is really rich. It's well researched, obviously, as he used to be a teacher before he became an academic, and then going on to get his PhD at Harvard. So he really knows to put in the work to make sure that what he's saying is not only factual, but also drives the point home that he's trying to make. And I really loved the inserts from actual historical figures. He had put in quotes from either enslaved people or recently freed people that were interviewed in newspapers from way back then. And that kind of also gives you a different perspective on how slavery is viewed through the modern lens, because you really have to think about what they were going through. There's also a bit he mentions whether the quotes that the freed people were giving were actually the true quotes that they wanted to give, based on who was interviewing them, you know, because you really don't want to upset the person that's interviewing you, especially if they have power to kind of alter your life. So one of the chapters that really stuck with me was when he went to the Angola prison. So this prison is in Louisiana. It's probably I think he says it's about like a couple miles outside of New Orleans. So once you get outside of the city, it starts to become a bit more sparse and it comes to be a bit more isolated. In that prison, he got to go in and he visited two parts of it that I remember off the top of my head, which was he got to visit the solitary confinement room, which is a really, really small room. The way he described it, I felt the walls closing in on me. And then he also got to visit an electric chair that they had. And you're allowed to sit in it for whatever reason. I personally would not have done it. He did it, more power to him. And he describes just sitting in that chair. It's not turned on in any way, shape, or form. It's basically just a wooden chair with like the straps next to it. But if you sit in it, you can almost feel the electricity that would have gone through if they had just turned that switch on, if it was still working. And it made my chest hurt a lot, just thinking about all the men who had to go through that way. And I think it's still, in some states, it's still a practice that they still do now, and I think it's absolutely awful. And he also references a story of a young black man who was actually sentenced to the electric chair. But for some reason, the operator was really drunk and he miscalculated something, and as they're going to pull the lever and he's about to die, it doesn't work. So he lives. He experiences that really frightening moment where you think you're gonna die, and you almost feel like your life fading away from you, but you actually don't. And that's an experience the average person would never really get to experience except for him. And even the guy was like, I can't even describe what that was like. It felt like I was gonna go to heaven and then I'm stuck here. And so then his family tried to overturn the conviction, and unfortunately, a year later, he was re-put back into that electric chair, and he did die that time. And it's a story that kind of almost falls through the cracks when you think about the history of everything, even just beyond, you know, prison treatments. You think about, you know, that could have been somebody that I knew, that could have been me, that could have been anybody. And so this book really opened my eyes to everything. Another thing that I learned throughout the book was that actually New York City had a part to play in the slave trade. It was very slow moving, the way that they had slaves come in through New York, but eventually they were a really big proponent of it. Not as much as the South, but it was still part of their history. And what I came to learn was that Central Park itself used to be home to a black neighborhood. But eventually, the government decided, no, we don't want you anymore there. And they shuffled them all out, and then they built Central Park. So underneath Central Park, that millions and millions of visitors visit every year, there used to be a black thriving neighborhood that housed these freed people. And without the care of like museums and historians, they would be essentially forgotten underneath all the people who walked through there. What I did like the most is that he does mention the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I briefly interned with them last year, and it was arguably one of the best experiences I could ever have. I learned so much throughout that internship, not only from the internship that I was going through, but as well as just the amount of knowledge and research that goes into any of the topics that they put out on their website. They're a wonderful institution, and I'm not just being biased because I worked there for a little bit. I think the work that they put in is really amazing. I actually visited the museum before I interned there a couple years ago, and I think it's a museum that everybody should really go to. Any of the Smithsonian museums, everybody should go to at least once, or at least try and go on their website and see the information that they have, because everything is meticulously well researched, just like this book, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I give it 5 stars. If you're into nonfiction, especially in terms of grappling with how slavery has impacted not only America but also outside of that, I think it's a really great book. Clint Smith, he's an amazing writer. There's so many quotes in there that I could just rattle off and just they would just be so poignant. I'm really grateful that I picked up this book, especially for Black History Month. And if you pick up this book, let me know. And yeah, so that's my review of Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with History of Slavery Across America. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!